11 years missing from a resume, Grant Holloway said, lifting the single sheet beneath the cold white studio lights, is not experience. It is surrender. The audience gave an uncertain laugh, the kind people offered when a powerful man expected agreement, and Grant smiled as though he had already won. He believed the quiet woman seated across from him had come to beg for a place inside his company. He had no idea she was carrying the authority to take that company away from him. Claire Reed sat with her hands folded over a worn leather portfolio, wearing a cream blouse, a navy skirt, and plain black shoes that had never appeared in a fashion magazine. Nothing about her suggested influence. Nothing about the resume in Grant's hand suggested wealth, power, or ambition. That was precisely why the producers of America at Work had chosen her for the live interview. The segment was supposed to show how Asteron Technologies gave ordinary Americans a second chance. Grant had agreed because he believed compassion looked impressive on television, especially when someone else had to provide it. Behind them, a wall-sized screen displayed the silver Asteron logo above the words "Building Tomorrow." Cameras moved silently across polished tracks. Red lights glowed. Nearly 4 million viewers watched from homes, offices, airport lounges, and restaurant televisions across the country. Grant leaned back in his chair, his tailored charcoal suit sharp against the blue set. His platinum watch caught the light as he tapped Claire's resume with one finger. Community bookkeeping, he read. Part-time consulting with no clients listed. Family caregiving. And then an 11-year gap. He looked toward the audience, allowing the silence to become part of his performance. Ms. Reed, Asteron is a multi-billion-dollar technology company. What made you believe this resume belonged in an executive strategy interview? Claire's expression did not change. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a simple knot, and her gray eyes remained steady on the man who had spent years presenting himself as the visionary who built Asteron from nothing. I was invited, she said. Her voice was soft, but the microphone carried every word. Grant laughed once. Invitations open doors. Qualifications keep them open. A few people applauded. Claire glanced past him toward the studio clock. It was 3:53 p.m. Eastern Time. 7 minutes remained before the closing bell on Wall Street. 7 minutes before a confidential transaction Grant believed no one could stop became eligible for final approval. 7 minutes before thousands of Asteron employees could lose their jobs without ever understanding why. Grant mistook her glance for nervousness. Take your time, he said with polished cruelty. Live television can be difficult for people who are not accustomed to serious rooms. Claire lowered her eyes to the leather portfolio. Inside rested an original corporate charter, a controlling trust certificate, and a resolution requiring only one final signature. She had not come to ask Grant Holloway for employment. She had come to let him speak long enough to prove exactly what kind of man had taken control of her company. The clock changed to 3:54. Claire looked up. Mr. Holloway, she said, before you decide whether I belong here, may I ask who you believe owns Asteron? Grant's smile widened. Somewhere beyond the cameras, a lawyer reached for his phone. The room had not gone silent yet, but it was about to. Grant leaned back as if the question amused him. I do, he said, along with the board, the investors, and the people who actually built this company. The answer came quickly, polished by years of interviews, shareholder meetings, and carefully rehearsed speeches. Claire gave a small nod, but her eyes moved past him to the silver letters mounted across the studio wall. Asteron Technologies. 20 years earlier, those letters had been written in black marker on a cardboard sign taped above a folding table in a rented garage outside Boston. Claire had been 22 then, sleeping 4 hours a night and living on coffee, canned soup, and the stubborn belief that a new kind of adaptive operating system could change the industry. Grant had not written the first line of code. He had not repaired the overheated prototype at 2 in the morning or spent weekends calling small manufacturers who refused to return messages. He had arrived 6 months later with a business degree, an expensive briefcase, and a gift for making other people's work sound like his vision. At first, Claire had welcomed him. Asteron needed investors, and Grant knew how to fill a room with confidence. He spoke about expansion while Claire spoke about engineering. Together, they had looked balanced. Then her mother became ill. What began as a few missed meetings became hospital visits, medication schedules, and long nights in a quiet house where success suddenly felt less important than time. Claire stepped away from daily operations, believing the protections in the company charter would preserve her role until she returned. Grant sent flowers. He promised to protect what they had built. While Claire cared for the woman who had raised her, Grant slowly revised the story. Interviews began calling him the founder instead of a founder. Photographs disappeared from the company website. Employees who remembered Claire retired, transferred, or learned not to correct him. By the time her mother passed away, Grant's version of Asteron had become the only version the public knew. Claire never challenged him. Grief had made publicity feel small, and the founder trust still held its controlling votes in silence. She believed the company remained faithful to its original purpose. That belief ended 3 weeks before the broadcast, when a former engineer sent her a confidential file. Grant planned to sell Asteron's core patents to North Star Equity, close 3 American facilities, and eliminate 4,200 jobs. The agreement would reward Grant with a personal package worth $80 million. Now, under the studio lights, he was mocking the years Claire had spent caring for her mother while preparing to abandon thousands of families for profit. "You built it?" Claire asked. Grant's smile tightened. "From the ground up." Claire looked at the clock. 3:55. "Then you should remember the first prototype." For the first time, something uncertain crossed his face. Claire continued, "Model Cedar. For processors, a cooling fault, and a handwritten patch completed at 2:17 in the morning." Grant's fingers stopped tapping the resume. No journalist had ever known that name. No current executive had ever seen that machine. Claire rested one hand on the leather portfolio. "Tell me, Mr. Holloway," she said quietly, "who wrote the patch?" The audience waited. Grant opened his mouth, but the answer did not come. Grant opened his mouth, but the answer did not come. For one long second, the confidence that had carried him through boardrooms and television interviews disappeared beneath the studio lights. Then he smiled again, thinner this time. "Technical trivia from 20 years ago is hardly relevant to modern leadership," he said. "Companies survive because executives make difficult decisions, not because someone remembers the name of an old machine." Natalie Brooks, seated a few feet away, glanced toward her producer. This was no longer the uplifting employment segment the network had planned, but the red lights above the cameras remained steady. The broadcast was still live. Claire watched Grant carefully. She had seen him do this before. When facts threatened him, he changed the subject. When questions exposed him, he questioned the person asking them. Grant lifted the torn edge of her resume and turned toward the audience. "This is exactly the problem with nostalgia," he continued. "People confuse being present at the beginning with earning a place in the future." His words drew a smaller response than before. The laughter had faded. "Ms. Reed may know an old project name, but that does not qualify her to advise a company with more than 12,000 employees." Claire folded her hands in her lap. "Then perhaps you can answer something current." Grant gestured with false generosity. "Please, educate us. Who owns the controlling rights to Asteron's adaptive systems patents?" Claire asked. Grant barely paused. "Asteron Technologies owns all company intellectual property." "Under which entity?" Claire asked. His jaw tightened. "That is a legal distinction with no practical relevance." Claire nodded once. "What does Section 14 of the original corporate charter require before those patents can be transferred to an outside buyer?" The audience became still. Natalie leaned forward. Grant looked toward the side of the stage, where one of his communications advisors stood beyond the lights. No assistance came. "Corporate charters are handled by counsel," he said. "A chief executive officer does not memorize every clause." "Of course," Claire replied. "Then one final question. Who controls the Class B voting shares?" Grant set the resume on the table. His fingers were no longer relaxed. "The board and principal shareholders exercise voting authority according to company bylaws." "That was not my question." Her voice remained gentle, but something in the room had changed. Grant was still seated in the larger chair. His name was still displayed beneath the company logo. Yet the authority seemed to be moving across the table, one quiet sentence at a time. The studio clock changed to 3:57. 3 minutes remained before the market closed. Grant straightened his tie. "This interview is about your qualifications, Ms. Reed, not corporate governance." "You brought up leadership," Claire said. "I am trying to understand yours." A murmur moved through the audience. Grant's cheeks darkened beneath the makeup applied before the broadcast. My leadership turned Asteron into a global company, he said. I built its value, protected its future, and earned the authority to decide where it goes next. Claire looked toward Natalie. May I clarify that statement for the viewers? Natalie hesitated, then nodded. Go ahead. Claire turned back to Grant. Are you saying, on the record, that you own Asteron and possess full authority to sell its core patents without approval from any controlling founder or trust? Grant recognized the trap only as pride closed the door behind him. Millions of people were watching. His board members were watching. The buyers from Northstar Equity were watching. To retreat now would make him look uncertain. He leaned toward the microphone. Yes, he said. That is exactly what I am saying. Claire glanced at the studio clock. 3:58. Then she rested her hand on the worn leather portfolio. Good, she said quietly. Now we finally have it on the record. Grant stared at Claire as though the words were too small to matter, but the silence around him had grown heavy. Natalie Brooks glanced toward the control booth, where producers were speaking urgently behind a glass. No one stopped the broadcast. The clock above the stage read 3:58 in the afternoon. On the record? Grant repeated, forcing a laugh. This entire program is on the record. Claire opened the leather portfolio just far enough to remove a cream-colored document. She placed it on the table between them without turning it toward the cameras. Then you should have no objection to confirming your statement in writing. Grant looked down at the page. Across the top, in plain black letters, were the words Executive Certification of Authority. His expression shifted for only a moment. Where did you get this? He asked. It was included in the transaction materials submitted to Northstar Equity, Claire replied. The version awaiting final approval requires your certification that no founder, trust, or controlling shareholder retains the power to block the transfer. Natalie leaned closer. Mr. Holloway, is that accurate? Grant did not answer her. His eyes moved across the document, searching for a hidden threat. Claire knew he would find none. The language was simple because Grant's own legal team had written it. He had already approved the wording during a private meeting 2 days earlier. The only difference was that he had expected to sign it behind closed doors, surrounded by people whose careers depended on his approval. Now millions of Americans were watching. This is confidential corporate material, Grant said. It should not be part of an employment interview. You made corporate ownership part of the interview, Claire answered. Her voice remained calm. You said you built Asteron. You said you own it. You said no founder or trust can overrule you. This document simply confirms those claims. Grant glanced toward the audience. The admiration he expected was no longer there. People were watching him with the quiet attention reserved for someone standing at the edge of his own contradiction. His communications advisor raised one hand from beyond the lights, silently urging him to stop. Grant turned away. Pride had carried him too far to retreat gracefully. Bring me a pen, he said. Natalie hesitated before sliding one across the table. Grant took it and looked directly into the nearest camera. This is what leadership looks like, he declared. Decisive, accountable, unafraid of manufactured distractions. He signed his name with a broad, practiced stroke. Grant Michael Holloway. The pen touched the table with a sharp click. There, he said. That is what a real signature looks like. The studio clock changed to 3:59. Claire studied the page, not with triumph, but with the solemn attention of someone watching a door close for the final time. Grant had just certified that no controlling founder existed. He had also certified that he had disclosed every restriction on the sale. Both statements were false, and the live broadcast had preserved them before witnesses across the country. Natalie looked at Claire. What happens now? Claire reached deeper into the portfolio and removed an older document, its edges softened by 2 decades of careful storage. A faded blue seal appeared near the bottom. Grant saw it, and the color began to leave his face. Claire placed the original charter beside his newly signed certification. Now, she said, we compare your signature with the one that created the authority you just claimed. Grant's eyes dropped to the founding page. Beneath the company seal was a name he had spent years removing from websites, interviews, and history. Claire Elizabeth Bennett. His lips parted, but no sound followed. Claire uncapped a second pen. You wanted to show America what a real signature looks like, she said quietly. Then perhaps it is time you saw mine. The name beneath the seal seemed to pull 20 years of air from the room. Grant stared at it, then at Claire, as if changing his focus might change the truth. "Bennett," he whispered. Natalie Brooks looked from the charter to the woman sitting beside her. "Claire Bennett." Claire gave a small nod. "Claire Elizabeth Bennett Reed. I used my married name after I stepped away from daily operations." The audience remained silent. Even the soft movement of the cameras seemed suddenly loud. Grant recovered just enough to force a dismissive smile. "Anyone can share a name," he said. "An old signature does not prove current authority." Claire reached into the portfolio and removed a faded photograph. It showed 3 young people inside a cramped garage, standing behind a metal table crowded with circuit boards and tangled cables. Grant was easy to recognize despite the years. Beside him stood Claire, younger, tired, and smiling as she held the original Cedar processor in both hands. On the cardboard sign behind them, someone had written Astron Systems. "That photograph was taken on March 12, 20 years ago," Claire said, 2 days after Model Cedar completed its first stable run. Natalie lifted the image so the nearest camera could see it. A murmur passed through the audience. Grant's eyes remained fixed on Claire. He remembered that night. He remembered the applause when the prototype finally worked. More than anything, he remembered who had written the code. Claire opened a thick engineering notebook and turned to a marked page. Her handwriting filled the paper with equations, timing notes, and cooling adjustments. At the bottom was the same signature printed on the charter. "I designed the adaptive system," she continued. "I wrote the patch you could not name. I negotiated the original patent assignment. And I created the Founder Trust to ensure that no executive could sell Astron's core technology without approval from the people who built it." Grant shook his head. "You resigned." "I left operational management," Claire corrected. "I never surrendered my shares, my patents, or my voting rights." The studio clock changed to 4 o'clock. The closing bell had sounded in New York. A small green light appeared on Thomas Reed's tablet beyond the stage, confirming that the market had closed and the legal hold could now be announced without disrupting active trading. Grant saw the signal and finally understood that the timing had never been accidental. "Why now?" he asked. The question no longer sounded like a challenge. "Because 3 weeks ago, I learned that you planned to transfer our patents, close 3 facilities, and eliminate 4,200 positions," Claire said. "You intended to reward yourself while families in Ohio, Massachusetts, and North Carolina paid the cost." Grant turned toward Natalie. "This is a staged attack." "End the broadcast." Natalie touched the earpiece beneath her hair, listened for a moment, and then faced him. "The network has verified the charter seal and the trust registration. We are continuing." Claire removed one final document from the portfolio. It carried the letterhead of Astron's outside counsel and the signatures of 2 independent board members. Grant recognized it immediately. "You cannot do this without board confirmation," he said. "I already have it," Claire replied. "The board was waiting for you to certify your authority." A side door opened, and Thomas Reed entered the studio carrying a sealed folder. Grant rose halfway from his chair, then stopped when Thomas placed the folder beside Claire. "The Founder Trust remains active," Thomas announced. "Ms. Bennett Reed is its sole trustee and controls 58% of Astron's Class B voting power." Grant's face became still. The resume he had mocked lay torn between them. The original founder sat across from him with the votes, the documents, and the truth. Claire placed the final resolution on the table and rested the pen above the signature line. "You spent years removing my name," she said. "You should have checked whether you had removed my authority." Claire lowered the pen, but she did not sign immediately. Grant watched her hand hover above the resolution, and for the first time that afternoon, he looked less like the most powerful man in the room than someone waiting for a door to close. Thomas Reed opened the sealed folder and placed 3 documents beside the original charter. "The independent directors reviewed the proposed North Star transaction this morning," he said. "They also reviewed the undisclosed executive compensation agreement, the planned facility closures, and the certification Mr. Holloway signed on this broadcast." Grant turned toward him. "You work for the company." "I work for Astron," Thomas replied. "That is not always the same as working for its chief executive officer." A quiet murmur moved through the audience. Natalie Brooks leaned toward the documents. "What exactly did Mr. Holloway's signature trigger?" Thomas looked at Claire before answering. "Under Section 14 of the Founding Charter, any executive who knowingly attempts to transfer protected intellectual property without approval from the founder trust, may be suspended pending a formal investigation. His certification established that the decision was intentional, not accidental. Grant's voice sharpened. That is your interpretation. It is the interpretation approved by the independent board members and outside counsel, Thomas said. The wall-sized screen behind them flickered. The silver company logo disappeared, replaced by a secure video connection. Eleanor Price, chairwoman of Asteron's board, appeared from a conference room overlooking downtown Boston. Four directors sat beside her, each with a copy of the same resolution in front of them. Grant stared at the screen. Eleanor, shut this down. Eleanor did not move. You told the board that the founder trust no longer had enforceable authority, she said. You told us Claire Bennett had permanently relinquished her voting rights. Both statements were false. I acted in the company's best interest. You acted without the company's consent, Eleanor replied. The distinction landed with greater force than anger ever could. Claire remained still, listening as the institution Grant believed he controlled began speaking in a voice that no longer belonged to him. Eleanor turned toward her. Ms. Bennett Reed, the board recognizes the founder trust and its 58% Class B voting authority. We are prepared to receive your instruction. Grant leaned closer to Claire, lowering his voice as though privacy still existed beneath the studio lights. Think carefully. Investors will panic. Employees will suffer. You cannot dismantle 20 years of leadership during a television program. Claire met his eyes. You were willing to dismantle 20 years of their lives in a private contract. Grant glanced toward the torn resume on the table. This is personal. No, Claire said. If it were personal, I would have returned when you removed my photograph. I returned when you decided 4,200 families were acceptable losses. She turned the resolution toward the cameras. It did not transfer money to her. It did not grant her a new title. It suspended Grant, froze the North Star sale, preserved the 3 facilities, and authorized an independent review of every executive agreement connected to the transaction. The document was not revenge. It was protection. Grant looked toward Natalie, then the audience, searching for the sympathy he had denied Claire only minutes earlier. He found none. Claire placed the pen against the signature line. The microphone captured the faint sound of ink moving across paper as she wrote the name history had tried to erase. Claire Elizabeth Bennett Reed. Thomas checked the page, then looked toward Eleanor. The resolution is effective immediately. On the screen, Eleanor signed her acknowledgement. One by one, the other directors followed. Grant's phone lit up on the table. Access suspended. Executive authority revoked. Transaction placed under legal hold. The messages appeared faster than he could read them. He reached for the device, then stopped, his hand suspended over the glass. Claire capped the pen and placed it beside the 2 torn halves of her resume. That, she said quietly, is what a signature looks like when it answers to more than pride. The room went silent. For several seconds, Grant did not move. The phone beneath his hand continued to glow with messages he no longer had the authority to answer. Around him, the studio remained so quiet that the soft hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than before. He had entered the broadcast believing every camera belonged to him. Now those same cameras were recording the moment his power became memory. Natalie Brooks turned toward Thomas Reed. What happens to Mr. Holloway now? Thomas closed the folder with deliberate care. He is suspended from all executive duties, effective immediately. His access to company systems, facilities, financial accounts, and internal communications has been revoked pending investigation. Grant rose from his chair. You cannot remove me in front of the country and expect the company to survive the night. Claire remained seated. The company survived before you, she said. It will survive after you. His eyes moved toward the board members on the screen. Eleanor, I increased the market value by 600%. I expanded into 14 countries. I made Asteron matter. Eleanor Price held his gaze. You made yourself visible. That is not the same as making the company valuable. Grant looked toward the audience, then toward the employees standing beyond the studio lights. Megan Cole, his young executive assistant, stood near the side entrance clutching a tablet against her chest. Earlier that morning, Grant had criticized her for using the wrong font in a briefing document. He had told her that people from ordinary backgrounds should be grateful just to stand near important decisions. Now she watched him with an expression that held no satisfaction, only recognition. She had seen this moment coming in 100 smaller moments he had dismissed. "Megan," Grant called, "contact security and have these people removed." Megan did not move. Thomas answered for her. "Security reports to interim corporate authority now." Grant turned back to Claire. "You planned this humiliation." "I planned accountability," she replied. "You chose the location." The words settled over the set without needing emphasis. Grant had demanded the live interview because he wanted a public display of dominance. He had approved the cameras, selected the audience, and insisted that Claire's resume be shown on the screen behind them. Every detail intended to make her look small had become evidence of his own judgment. Natalie lifted the two torn halves of the resume. "Ms. Bennett Reed, why did you allow him to continue after you knew he was misrepresenting your history?" Claire looked at the paper. "Because people reveal what they believe when they think no consequences are coming." She placed the two pieces together along the torn edge. "If I had introduced myself first, he would have been courteous. He would have offered me coffee, praised my experience, and pretended to respect every year of my life. I needed the board, the employees, and the public to see how he treated someone he believed had no power." Grant's expression tightened. "This has nothing to do with leadership." Claire looked up at him. "It has everything to do with leadership. Character is not how you speak to the person who can remove you. It is how you speak to the person you believe cannot." No one applauded immediately. The truth was too clean for celebration. Then a single pair of hands began near the back of the audience. Another followed. Within seconds, the sound filled the studio, not loud with triumph, but steady with relief. Grant stood alone beside the chair that no longer belonged to him. Claire did not smile. She simply gathered the original charter, the signed resolution, and the torn resume into one careful stack. Power had changed hands, but dignity had never left hers. The applause faded slowly, leaving Grant surrounded by a silence he could no longer control. He looked at Claire with the desperate anger of a man who had lost the story he had spent years writing about himself. "You wanted revenge," he said. "That is why you came here. You waited until the cameras were live because you wanted the whole country to watch me fall." Claire studied him for a moment, then placed the torn resume back on the table. "If I wanted revenge, I would have returned when you removed my name from the company website," she said. "I would have returned when you told reporters you created Asteron alone. I would have returned when the photograph of the original team disappeared from the lobby." Her eyes remained steady. "I did not." Grant glanced toward the audience, as if searching for someone willing to believe him. No one spoke. Claire opened another folder Thomas had brought onto the stage. Inside were copies of employee notices, pension reports, and internal financial projections. She lifted the first document. "This is the closure plan for the Dayton facility in Ohio. 1,300 employees." She placed it down and lifted another. "This is the plan for Worcester, Massachusetts. 1,700 positions." A third page followed. "And this is Charlotte, North Carolina. 1,200 jobs." Natalie looked at the documents, her expression changing as the numbers became people. "For 1,200 employees," she said quietly. "Yes," Claire replied. "And many of them have spouses, children, mortgages, medical bills, and parents who depend on them." Grant shook his head. "Restructuring is difficult. That does not make it wrong." "No," Claire said. "But hiding executive bonuses inside the sale agreement does." Thomas placed a compensation schedule beside the other documents. The figure at the bottom was impossible to ignore. $80 million. Grant looked away. Claire continued. "You plan to reduce the employee pension contribution 3 weeks before the sale. You ordered senior engineers to sign silence agreements. You called longtime employees legacy expenses." Megan Cole lowered her eyes. She had typed those words into a presentation because Grant had dictated them. Claire turned toward her, not with accusation, but with understanding. People like Megan were expected to carry out decisions they were never allowed to question. Grant's voice weakened. "You do not understand what it takes to run a company this size." Claire looked at the worn resume between them. "You are right about one thing. There are 11 years missing from that page." She paused. "During those years, I managed medication schedules, insurance appeals, hospital appointments, household bills, and the fear of losing the person who taught me never to measure human worth by income." Her voice softened, but it did not break. "My mother did not become less valuable when she became ill. I did not become less capable because I stayed beside her. The room was completely still. You called those years surrender, Claire continued. They taught me patience, responsibility, and the difference between authority and care. Those are lessons no executive title could have given me. Grant looked down at the resume he had torn for entertainment. So this is about what I said to you? No, Claire replied. It is about what you believed when you said it. You believed caregiving was weakness. You believed ordinary workers were replaceable. You believed anyone without visible power could be dismissed. She gathered the closure plans into a single stack. I did not come back because you erased my name. I came back because you were about to erase 4,200 lives from a spreadsheet and call it leadership. Grant had no answer. Under the bright studio lights, the man who had claimed to build the future finally saw the human cost of the one he had planned. 3 months later, morning light poured through the glass entrance of Asteron Technologies, illuminating a wall that no longer told a convenient lie. The words founded by Claire Bennett and the original Asteron engineering team now appeared beneath the silver company name. Beside them hung the old photograph from the garage, restored where employees and visitors could finally see it. Claire arrived without an entourage, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying the same worn leather portfolio. She had declined the permanent chief executive position, choosing instead to serve as chairwoman of the Founder Trust while Eleanor Price led the company through its transition. Claire had never returned for a title. She had returned to protect a promise. The North Star sale was canceled. The facilities in Ohio, Massachusetts, and North Carolina remained open. No mass layoffs occurred, and the employee pension contributions were restored before a single family lost what had been promised. An independent investigation found that Grant had concealed executive payments and repeatedly misrepresented the authority behind the proposed sale. He resigned from the board and surrendered the compensation connected to the transaction. There was no dramatic farewell and no final speech. One morning, his name simply disappeared from the executive directory, much as Claire's had disappeared years earlier. The difference was that Claire had been erased by ambition, while Grant was removed by accountability. Inside the Human Resources Department, workers gathered for the launch of a new program called the Second Chapter Initiative. It offered training, mentorship, and fair interviews to parents, caregivers, veterans, and others returning to work after long absences. Employment gaps would no longer be treated as proof of failure. Applicants would be asked what they had learned, what responsibilities they had carried, and what strengths they were bringing back. Megan Cole stood near the front of the room, now serving as Director of Employee Communications. Her first company-wide message had not celebrated profits or executive titles. It had thanked the workers whose names rarely appeared in annual reports, but whose effort kept Asteron alive. When Claire entered, Megan handed her a narrow black frame. Inside were the two halves of the resume Grant had torn on live television, carefully joined along the center. Beneath them was a small brass plate engraved with 7 words. Never confuse an unexplained chapter with an empty life. Claire traced the edge of the frame with one finger. For a moment, she thought of her mother, of quiet hospital rooms, late insurance calls, and the years the world had reduced to a blank space. Those years had never been empty. They had held love, exhaustion, sacrifice, and a kind of leadership no boardroom could teach. Claire carried the frame into the new interview center and hung it where every hiring manager would see it before meeting an applicant. Then she stepped back. Through the glass wall, a woman in her early 40s waited for an interview, nervously smoothing a modest jacket over her resume. A 5-year employment gap appeared halfway down the page. The interviewer welcomed her, offered her a seat, and asked what experiences had shaped her during those years. The woman's shoulders relaxed. She began to speak, and this time, someone listened. Claire watched silently from the hallway before walking away. Grant had mocked the only page he could see. Her signature had revealed the history he tried to erase, but the company was not changed by the power she reclaimed. It was changed by what she chose to do with it. And in the place where appearances had once decided who belonged, dignity finally became part of the foundation.